Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for being with us today. Memorial Day is a few weeks away, marking what many consider the official kickoff of summer. That is often the time when people fill up the tank and head out for a road trip, or pack their bags and hop on a plane for a vacation. But the prices of gas and airfare have many Americans thinking twice about their travel plans. The price of a gallon of gas in the U.S. has gone up by 50% since the war in Iran began back in March, with the national average now sitting around $4.53 per gallon. International air travelers have seen the cost of flights rise about $150 per ticket since April. Between rising jet fuel costs and the sudden closure of Spirit Airlines, air travel is expected to continue to see challenges, with airlines already having cut roughly 9.3 million seats during the upcoming summer months. Experts warn that reduced capacity will certainly mean higher airfare for flyers. We'll spend most of the show today looking at the travel landscape and how rising costs will impact consumers and the wider economy. In studio with me today, we have Michael Goldberg, Executive Director of the Veal Institute for Entrepreneurship and a Professor of Design and Innovation at Case Western Reserve University. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Also joining by video, we have Zach Wichter. He's a travel reporter for USA Today, focusing on the airline industry. Zach, welcome back to you.
Thanks. Great to be back.
And if you would like to join this conversation, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org, or you can message us on Instagram. We're at The Sound of Ideas. Now, Michael, as someone who keeps an eye on a number of economic factors, big picture, what has your impression been over the last 2 months or so as fuel prices have been increasing when we talk about affordability and economic uncertainty?
We're feeling it on a whole bunch of levels, and we'll talk about it today, it's booking flights and trying to figure out the timing of that. I mean, jet fuel prices have spiked with the conflict in Iran, and we're seeing it in pricing. And for those of us that may be looking to go closer to home and fill up our tanks, in Ohio is such a great place, and Cleveland's a great place, as we all know, because so many things are reachable in driving distance. You see the price of gas at the gas station, so it's up. So summer travel is really important. I'm heading out to a graduation next week. There's certain things that we do in our lives, whether it's celebrating a graduation or doing a summer vacation, that are sort of part of Americans' normal plans. And I think people are rethinking, based on affordability, sort of what makes sense for them, whether it's driving or flying, but everything's more expensive.
Mm. And Zach, big picture perspective as we move towards the summer travel months, what are you seeing in terms of airline prices and gasoline prices, having maybe a double whammy on customers right now putting together travel plans?
Yeah, as we head into the summer, which is always already an expensive season to travel, prices are going up. Airlines are trying to cover their costs with these rising fuel prices and paying at the pump. Travelers who are driving are paying more as well. And so it's going to be an expensive summer, and I think that's going to change the way that people travel a little bit.
Have you heard anything from people in your just anecdotal research or conversations about people changing or canceling plans, Zach?
I haven't really heard about people canceling plans. It's more hesitancy to book plans in the first place, especially for folks who are thinking about traveling abroad this summer. There just feels like there's so much uncertainty. We see these warnings out of Europe that they could be running up against a fuel shortage at airports. There are also questions about how safe it is to fly through the Middle East right now with the conflict, given that the Middle East is such a major air hub if you're traveling farther afield. And so people aren't canceling plans, but they are definitely hesitating to book them in the first place because they don't want to get stuck somewhere or encounter other problems while they're traveling.
Zach, staying on this for a moment, when we're looking at airfare prices, I know you mentioned jet fuel shortage there. Is there anything that we can point to that dictates pricing for fares? Is it pretty well connected to the jet fuel prices, or are there many other factors at play?
I wish I had an easy answer for that question. Jet fuel is certainly a big input and influences prices, but we are seeing airlines trying to address their rising costs in other ways by raising fees, like the fee for checked bags and that sort of thing. Airline pricing can be extremely opaque. And so over the years, the advice that I've heard from experts is essentially, if you feel like you're getting a good deal on airfare, you should book it, kind of trust your gut. But certainly, as we head into the summer, another factor is going to be, and we mentioned this at the top a little bit, the exit of Spirit Airlines from the market. As a major ultra low cost carrier, Spirit had an influence on the market nationwide where it drove prices down, especially in markets where it was competing with other airlines. And so, without that pressure, airlines are going to have an easier time raising fares. That said, some of the analysts who I've spoken to have also warned that if Spirit's former competitors raise fares too much too quickly, they could cannibalize some of their demand and turn some people off from traveling. So as we head into this summer with people being so price sensitive, it's going to be a careful balancing act, but I do think that we're going to continue to see this upward trend in airfares for a while.
Let's stay on the Spirit Airlines conversation since we're talking about that now. Zach, what led to the folding of Spirit Airlines? Can you tell us?
Another one that's hard to answer in one simple phrase. Okay, so I would say the immediate cause was the rise in fuel prices. Spirit has been struggling financially for quite some time, so this wasn't a complete surprise to analysts in the industry. But Spirit, which was in its second bankruptcy in 2 years, had a plan to come out of that bankruptcy that hinged on fuel prices being, I believe, around $2.70 a gallon for jet fuel. They've almost doubled. I think they're closer to $4.70 a gallon now. And so Spirit simply could not afford to operate in this higher cost environment. But there are some longer term trends that have hit Spirit pretty hard as well. Since the pandemic, people have really invested more in premium travel. There's been a rise in premium leisure travel. And because Spirit Airlines targeted a more budget conscious, a more price sensitive segment of the market, the recovery in that market segment was slower. And some of that demand shifted to more premium products. And so Spirit has been struggling for a while just because they serve a market that was contracting.
Michael, what do you think about the closure of Spirit and its impact on the greater travel economy?
Sure. And in Cleveland, we did have Spirit flights, particularly going into the Florida market. I mean, to some degree, I think as Zach referenced, while there has been movement away from that model, it kept folks honest. I mean, other carriers honest. So in markets where we don't have, as we're sitting here in Cleveland, we were just talking about an upcoming trip to Boston where you have JetBlue and Delta both in that market. When you have two competing carriers offering flights, consumers are going to see the benefit of what competition brings. So when Spirit exit the market, particularly for folks in Cleveland, I mean, ever since sort of 2014 when we lost our continental hub, part of the strategy in a place like Cleveland has been attracting lower cost carriers like Frontier and Spirit to the market. So we were not a huge Spirit hub here, but when you start to see those low cost carriers going away and there's less competition, consumers are going to pay more.
And Zach, when we look at the cancellations and rebookings that people have had to deal with the Spirit closure, which was pretty abrupt, how did the market respond to that in the airfare world?
Yeah, so airlines across the board essentially offered rescue fares to Spirit's passengers, which means that they said that they were capping prices or offering special deals within a certain window to help travelers who may have gotten stranded by Spirit Airlines' sudden closure complete their travel plans. Farther out, it's a little bit harder to say, but I agree. I think that we're just going to see airfares increase because Spirit really pressured the market to compete on price, and they were a major player doing that. So in the immediate aftermath, I wouldn't say that there's been a huge immediate bump in airfares, but I think we're looking at more medium and longer term trends.
What about the actual planes themselves that Spirit Airlines was operating? What happens to those, Zach?
That's a great question. So a lot of Spirit's planes were leased from another company. And so those planes, the majority of Spirit's fleet will just return to that lessor who will then release them to other airlines. The remainder of the planes that Spirit owned in full will be part of the liquidation proceedings and will eventually be sold off to help settle some of Spirit's outstanding debts. The good news is that Spirit flew a kind of planes in the Airbus A320 family, which is really a workhorse of the aviation industry. Those planes are not going to have any trouble getting redeployed. And so we're not likely to see a major decrease in capacity, although it's very possible that those planes may get deployed to other regions of the world. It just depends on who purchases them or who the lessors identify as possible candidates to send them to. It's also going to take some time for this to happen, so we will see a short-term decrease in capacity because the planes are going to have to be re-inspected and refit to conform to the fleet standards of whichever new airline they go to.
One more question here on this topic. When it comes to capacity, we talked about a bit earlier how, there are seats being slashed from routes for airlines. And Zach, I want to ask you about this. Have budget carriers like Spirit and Frontier created a capacity issue? It was making air travel more accessible to people who maybe didn't have access to it before, this kind of no-frills model at a lower cost. And will the airlines now have any issue keeping up, especially as routes are being cut?
So it's going to be interesting to see how other airlines respond in all of this. There will likely be some markets that lose air service, especially in the short term, if there are no competitor airlines. If Spirit was the only airline that served a particular market or a particular airport, other airlines are going to have to do some calculations and decide if that's worth serving. I do think that we're also going to see some decrease at the most price sensitive end of the market. I think that some of those travelers may be pushed out of flying if the remaining airlines raise their fares and don't compete for that low end of the market. One thing that I'm really interested to see, though, sort of broader effect that I think people haven't spoken about quite as much in all of this, is Spirit was really the catalyst that caused these other airlines to start unbundling their fares. Many other carriers introduced basic economy tickets as a way to compete with Spirit on price at a time when travelers were more price sensitive generally. And so I'm really intrigued to see going forward if these other remaining carriers see an increase in their basic economy ticket sales, or they traditionally have seen a pretty good degree of upsell where travelers who may be looking at a basic economy ticket decide to buy a more expensive economy ticket with more inclusions. So I'm interested to see how their ticket sales go from here and how Spirit Airlines capacity gets redistributed across the market.
I have noticed that with the airfare. Michael, I want to ask you about this model where you can get the basic economy, but maybe that only comes with a personal item. That doesn't come with something you can put in the overhead storage bin above you. Does this actually save people money, the introduction of these tiers over time, or is it just a way to trick us into actually spending some more money for the upsell?
Well, as a frequent traveler who's also buying a lot of tickets for my kids, I'm often looking at this to try to figure out, if purchasing a seat. Of course, for my kids, I make them stick it out and get their seat assignment at the airport but for me and my wife, I'm often willing to book ahead. It's interesting and it can be confusing, I think, for consumers. It's interesting that Zach sort of mentioned this sort of initial model that Spirit pioneered. Now, I do find it a bit bewildering, whether it's a traditional carrier or a discount carrier, to sort of figure out, does it make sense to go for the bundled price? I mean, I think some of this is just sort of consumers need to play around with these sites because I don't think everyone's a little bit different. And I do think that some of the tools, whether it's using something like Google Flights to monitor price change, again, you have to sort of put in the information that you're looking for as you sort of monitor these flights, or just AI in general to sort of be a tool to help navigate can be useful for consumers. Because yes, carriers, among other folks trying to sell stuff, can often benefit from this a little bit of confusion because it's not always clear, apples to apples, how to compare these fares.
It's a lot of math. You're trying to figure out how much
sure.
do I need for a weekend trip? Do I need to check a bag? Also, if you're bringing liquids, that's a factor for myself. Shampoo, facial care items, those kinds of things. All right, we are having a conversation about summer travel and cost concerns when it comes to that. We're talking about gas prices. We're also talking about airfare prices and the factors that play into what is happening in this current moment. If you want to be a part of this conversation, the number to call is 866-578-0903 if you have a question or a comment. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org or send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. We have been talking with Zach Wichter, consumer travel reporter with USA Today, and also Michael Goldberg, executive director at the Veal Institute and professor of design and innovation at Case Western Reserve University. We'll bring another person into this conversation now. Joining us, we have Patrick Dahan, petroleum analyst with GasBuddy. Patrick, welcome to The Sound of Ideas.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Patrick, can you give us a snapshot right now of where prices are sitting in Ohio when it comes to gas prices today?
Yeah, the statewide average in Ohio is $4.78 a gallon after spiking to nearly $5 at many stations across the state. We have seen some backward movement now. The statewide average is down about 6 cents a gallon from a week ago now after that big jump. And I do expect that we might inch a little bit lower, though it's a little early to say things are all clear. The state average, along with many other states in the Great Lakes, saw a big jump because of refining-related issues that affected primarily Great Lakes states. And that is why prices soared. But now some of those refining issues are being sorted out. In addition, the price of oil plummeting for the second straight day could add to some downward momentum here for gasoline and diesel prices, and of course jet fuel, since you're talking about airlines. But it's obviously very early. The strait remains closed, so I would put a caveat on the downward direction could abruptly shift as we navigate whatever is developing between the U.S. and Iran.
Just a little anecdotal note here. On Tuesday, I paid more than $5 per gallon to fill up my gas tank, and that was painful. And that had me thinking that I am just going to stay home and not drive as much as I possibly can. Patrick, I want to ask you, what are some of the areas around the country that are seeing the highest prices?
Well, we tend to see those high prices reserved for the West Coast, but really the Great Lakes not too far behind. Though looking at California this morning, the paying there, $6.16 a gallon in the state of California today, following closely behind Washington State at $5.75 a gallon. Of course, I'd be remiss, Hawaii also atop that leaderboard. Average prices in Hawaii today, $5.64. Oregon, Alaska, Nevada, all in the top tier of states. And then you have the Great Lakes due to some refining issues. But, it's pretty rare to see California's average now as high as it is. You'd have to go back to a brief window in 2022 to have seen it higher. Some states have also set new records for diesel. In fact, Ohio has set a new all-time record for diesel here just in the last week. And now we're starting to see some relief. But, you talk about diesel, you talk about gasoline being hugely critical to consumers and how they feel about the U.S. economy, whether you need fuel or not, you generally know the price. Diesel, certainly off the charts, is a little bit more of a harbinger of what could be coming in terms of inflation. When you talk about logistics and supply chains, the trickle-down is generally quite a bit slower. And so those $6 diesel prices are a bit of a worry. And by the way, this morning, no state has diesel prices below $5 a gallon now. So everybody's above $5. In fact, California for diesel now pushing $7.50 a gallon on average, with some areas of California now, including San Francisco, pushing an $8 a gallon average for diesel.
We have a call now from Kobe in Cleveland Heights. Kobe, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I just wanted to add to this conversation and say I saw a tweet the other day from Elizabeth Warren basically slamming the gas companies, saying that there may be some element of price gouging going on with this current economy and the current gas prices. Since the last times when oil got to over $100 a barrel, we did not see gas prices at $4.50. It was more like $3.70, $3.80. So is there any other elements that are causing the gas prices to become what they are now that is not just the price of oil? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Kobe. Patrick, I'll ask you if you can respond to that and talk to us about what goes into determining what we actually pay at the gas pump.
Yeah, that's a terrific question because oftentimes consumers remember that in 2008, oil hit $150 a barrel, and at the time that equated to a national average of about 4.10 a gallon. People have been using that ratio, that proportion since then. But a lot of politicians and consumers also don't consider that since then, the cost of doing business, property taxes, labor costs, taxes. I mean, almost every state has seen some increase in taxes compared to, say, 20 years ago when we had that run up. So, it's just like the cost of eggs may be lower, but that doesn't mean your breakfast bill when you go out to eat is going to be as low as it was, say 10 or 20 years ago. So it's the cost of doing businesses that has seen a very massive uptick, especially when you talk about, the federal minimum wage and now many states' de facto minimum wage of $15 an hour. It's labor costs that have gone up dramatically that now kind of change the proportion, that oil is this, gasoline should be that. That's been kind of rewritten because of COVID and all of the cost of doing businesses. Cost of doing business has gone up so much over the last 20 years when people are making that comparison.
Michael, let's talk about this. We're talking about the cost of doing business there. Sometimes the cost of doing business is the cost of fuel. So we just think about not necessarily moving people, but moving goods and food. So how will fuel prices potentially play into the increase in the price of goods for consumers?
I think we're seeing it. I mean, Patrick's insights were really helpful because there's a number of things that go into the basket that impact the overall price. Some of it, as we've alluded to, is moving. I mean, our food and other products are still primarily while we use rail. I mean, the trucking network is significant. So price of diesel directly impacts our trucking market as much as anything else. And I think it's hard for consumers. I mean, it's been a challenging, certainly even before the war in the Middle East started, it's been a challenging time for consumers. I mean, even as we sort of think back to the travel question specifically, I mean, credit card debt still remains high. People have not, a third of Americans haven't paid off their travel bill from last summer on their credit card. So, a quarter of Americans still don't have significant savings over, $500 or $1,000. So these times are difficult for Americans. I think, as you alluded to when you saw the sticker shock of a $5 a gallon, there's something about the gas price when we drive by it that sort of reminds us it's right there in numbers as we pass it on our car. But there's all these other factors that Americans are sort of seeing at the grocery store, going out and taking a family out for a meal to perhaps celebrate something wonderful like a graduation. So we're getting hit on a bunch of different aspects, and it can be a bit bewildering for the American consumer.
We have an email now from David B. in Cleveland Heights, and David writes, as people choose whenever they can to use less gas by driving less, combining trips, canceling trips, using public transportation, switching to electric vehicles or hybrids, etc., they reduce their own economic impact. However, as gas is bought less, would the laws of supply and demand lead to lower gas prices, or does this not apply in the current global and international situation? David notes, obviously not everyone is in the position to make these changes, but some can. So, Patrick, I want to ask you about that. Does that create a situation where the cost of gas gets lower, or does that create a situation where the cost of gas gets higher because it's being bought less?
Well, California may be a poor example for this because of outside factors in the state. But, generally you'll start to see reduced investment in maintaining refining capacity. Conventional wisdom might say that, prices will go down as demand goes down. But as demand goes down, less profit produced by refineries would then lead to reduced investment, which may eventually lead to reduced capacity. So it would probably not necessarily lead to lower prices because lower consumption would eventually lead to shutdown of weaker, less economical refineries if they're not profitable or to the degree that they can be sustained. And it would be a lumpy experience. That is, at first gasoline prices may be a little lower. Then you may have some refineries going offline, which would then be supportive for prices. And as overall demand, if you were talking about demand being 100% today and 0% in, say, 50 years, there'd be moments where there might be enough capacity and there would be lower prices, but then too much of that would likely lead to a refinery shutdown, which could then temporarily support higher prices. So it would be a lumpy decline in consumption, and there might be moments where prices could be lower, but generally over time there would be higher prices depending on the mismatch or the match between supply and demand and how that looked.
Zach, this is something you mentioned earlier a little bit related to the uncertainty of travel, particularly international travel, and the global conflict that's happening, the U.S. war in Iran. So will concerns over that conflict, Zach, do you think have a lasting impact, and also continuing conflict in Ukraine when it comes to airfare cost and availability?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to say. It really just depends on how these things get resolved. I can say with the Ukraine-Russia war, we've seen long-term effects in that many airlines, all airlines from the US are restricted from using Russian airspace, which affects flights to and from Asia. And so that results in airlines having to take longer, less efficient routes, which means they burn more fuel, which means prices generally increase. If we see this conflict with Iran really drag on, it could also affect the viability, as I talked about before, of some of those major Middle East air hubs, which are like very important connection points for traffic from the US to Asia and Africa. And so we could theoretically see a big shift around in the way that people travel to those places, but it remains to be seen. It all depends on the shape of this conflict. And so it's hard to say from here exactly how this shakes out because there are so many variables.
If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about travel concerns, whether that be by car or by plane or some other mode of transportation, and the costs associated with that and what people can expect potentially leading into the summer months, which is historically a very busy travel season. If you want to be a part of this conversation, the number to call is 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Patrick, on the topic of jet fuel versus gas that we use to fill up our automobiles, what are the priorities that are given there? We talk about a jet fuel shortage, and we talk about, access to filling up our gas tanks. Is there a certain degree of priority between the two? What does that look like?
Yeah, many refineries have been running, various types of oil for years. They're hooked up to their traditional sources. But what comes out of a barrel of oil is generally quite consistent. Now, it does vary from refinery to refinery based on what type of oil is available and what type of oil is refined. Generally speaking, out of a barrel of oil, 45% of it is gasoline, roughly 25% is diesel, and just under 10% gets turned into jet fuel. Now, there is some ability, depending on a refinery's complexity and what kind of equipment they have, whether they have hydrotreaters and FCCs, which are cat crackers. There are different pieces of large equipment at refineries designed to produce fuels. And each refinery is a little bit different. But right now, you have a lot of refineries that are heavily incentivized to skew as much as possible to get more jet fuel out of what they're producing. This is the beauty of how economics works, that when jet fuel prices are higher, and gasoline is arguably lower, that refineries, to the maximum of their ability, will start to change the yields where possible. But there's only so much cracking of molecules you can do, and if you don't have the right equipment, you may hit a maximum output. And a lot of refineries may vary. We just saw in Marathon's quarterly earning report that they made an investment to their massive Garyville, Louisiana refinery, which allowed them to yield 30,000 barrels a day more of jet fuel. So you might see more of these small projects where refineries may add equipment, may add processes to enhance the output of what they're getting. But generally across the board, what comes out of that barrel of oil is very refinery specific. And it's also very oil type specific of what type of oil is available to a refinery at their location.
We have an email question in now from Rich. Rich asks, do you believe that long-term price of gasoline will come down with the growth of hybrid vehicles? And Michael, I'd like to ask you to weigh in on that question and also get to the broader question there of what does it take to get consumers to change their behavior? Do you think we see a shift toward more hybrid or electric vehicles right now, or maybe a shift toward more public transportation or biking or something?
Well, we see that the impact of federal government incentives can have on spurring that market. So it's clear in this current federal administration, there's been a de-emphasis on electric cars, not necessarily hybrid cars, but a lot of the incentives that were available under the Biden administration for folks to purchase electric vehicles, which would obviously obviate some of the need for obviously this type of gasoline, have been moved away. And then you've sort of seen the reaction from auto manufacturers. The big U.S. auto manufacturers have de-emphasized some of their production capabilities. I think interestingly, and Tom Friedman's written a lot about this for the New York Times in terms of what he's seeing in China. I mean, China has gone all in. Certainly, they're still a producer, or still a consumer of fossil fuels, but they have overtaken U.S. leadership around electric cars. And yeah, it's interesting. I mean, political cycles can take a while. Politics are just sort of one piece of the puzzle, but we as a country, certainly there are consumers that are using hybrid and using electric vehicles, but I think the pace of that adoption has slowed, and it's clear that some of this was due to federal incentives going away.
Patrick, with Gas Buddy is an app that lets you know what the gas prices are nearby, so that helps people find the most affordable gas nearby if they're looking to fill up or top off their tank. I want to ask you this. I want to ask you if you can settle a debate in my household, and maybe you can't. Probably you can't. But is it better to put in a little bit of gas when the gas prices are uncertain, or should you just fill it up because you're there?
I mean, I don't think it really hurts anything. There's always kind of the mechanic that might, tell you about your fuel pump and running low. And, I just put in what I need. If prices are high and I'm anticipating that prices would come down, I'd probably just buy a couple of gallons, and call it good, especially if prices were going to come down significantly, right? I would just put in what I need for the next few days and then go fill my tank up when prices are more advantageous. But mechanics might tell you differently. They might tell you if you're always running around low, your fuel pump will warm up and it may, shorten the life of fuel pump, right? There's always these kind of old myths that get perpetuated, but I just do whatever is necessary, and I've never had a problem. I've never had a fuel pump go out either.
Okay, so we'll continue to both argue about it. Sounds good. Thank you for that, Patrick. We've got an email in from Colin. Colin says, wondering if anyone has any insight or comment on what this oil shock could do to the demand nationally for an increase in passenger rail connections. Anyone talking about it in Washington or in the private sector? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Patrick, have you heard any rumblings about this?
Well, I mean, politicians do love to spend money, but it's such a tremendous uptake. I mean, look at what California has been trying to do with rail. Look at the cost overruns. It is tremendously complex. And generally what happens is there might be an interest right now, but as soon as the situation improves, and who knows how long this will last, politicians then suddenly deprioritize it. And I think right now, the administration's attitude, the current administration's attitude on mass transit probably would not be conducive for, major infrastructure like this. And the U.S. is at a disadvantage compared to some European counterparts. You look at Germany, it's the size of Montana. It's a lot easier to build a full rail network in a state like Montana, which is the size of Germany. Becomes much more challenging to build across country.
Zach, I want to ask you about something that was potentially kicked around related to the Spirit Airlines closure, was a $500 million bailout package that was discussed by the Trump administration. What was your reaction to that?
I was surprised to see that. I understand why it happened, and I also have seen this campaign to resuscitate Spirit Airlines through crowdfunding. Since, and this is like a very brief history lesson, but since 1978, when the airline industry was deregulated, there's been this big debate about whether or not that was the right answer. And people on both sides of that debate have valid points, but I think that the $500 million bailout package, which would have given the Trump administration and therefore the U.S. government bonds for 90% equity in warrants for 90% equity in Spirit Airlines. That would have been a strange way to start renationalizing and re-regulating the U.S. airline industry. So, I understand why it happened. I think there was a lot of worry about the situation that we're in now, where Spirit leaves the market and what that's going to mean for consumers. But the $500 million bailout package, I think, took a lot of us who report on the industry by surprise.
Final question here as we wrap up this part of the conversation today. The partial government shutdown ended, Zach, but TSA agents there might not necessarily be the same amount of people doing the work there. Can you tell us any lasting disruptions we'll see from that shutdown?
Yeah, so during the partial government shutdown, I believe over 1,000 TSA officers left the agency. As we head into the summer, the agency does seem generally prepared to deal with crowds, but certainly they're going to have to do some rehiring. And anecdotally, I've heard that the agency may struggle to do that hiring because people have seen what's happened to these TSA agents over the last year or so. Who's going to want to apply for a job that you may miss your paycheck for half the year every few years if Congress doesn't act? So, it may not be the most attractive job prospect for potential applicants.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panel for being with us today to talk about travel concerns leading into the busy travel summer months. Zach Wichter, travel reporter for USA Today. Thank you for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Patrick DeHaan, the head of petroleum analysis for Gas Buddy. That's an app that helps drivers find the cheapest gas nearby. Patrick, thanks for being with us.
Thanks. My pleasure.
And Michael Goldberg, executive director of the Veal Institute for Entrepreneurship and a professor of design and innovation at Case Western Reserve University. Michael, thanks for being back with us.
Great to be here.